So we're going to try again. We're here at the Airport Sheraton in Cleveland, where Van and I just had the great opportunity to be at Baldwin Wallace University and a great conversation about where America's at. And I want to again commend Van, who was really, truly brilliant in his insights and his thinking about the whole country beyond left and right and beyond Republican, Democrat. But we're going to talk some more about the topic we're both working on, which is the whole challenge of opioid recovery and what we need to be doing as a country. And let me start by just saying that it's important to remember people dying from opioid overdoses have now passed automobiles as the #1 cause of accidental death. The first time since the rise of the mass-produced car that it is not the #1 cause of accidental death. So we both feel deeply the need to have a dramatically better opioid recovery model, because the current system actually at times detoxes somebody who's been an opioid addict, gets them to a point where their system has lost its ability to absorb large quantities of opiates. And then if the person backslides and takes what used to be an acceptable amount, they die. It's a very, very significant problem. So let me just start and say, you know this topic, you've been personally involved in it, and how would you frame where we are and what needs to be done?
Well, first of all, it's just an honor to get a chance to be with you, Mr. Speaker. We occasionally get a chance to go and talk to just ordinary, great people who are not in the Washington, D.C. world. They're not in the media world. They're people who are here in Ohio, living real lives, making real things happen at the community level. And it's an opportunity to really just talk common sense. And the speaker was brilliant as usual, and multiple applause from a bipartisan audience, because there's just some stuff that doesn't make sense, and stuff that does make sense. What we're doing right now with opioids doesn't make sense because people are doing what the doctor told them to do. It became very fashionable to say, well, we're doctors, we're not doing enough for pain, and perhaps they weren't. Let's really take pain seriously. We're going to pass out these pills. People take the pills. It turns out that it's very difficult for some people, for a lot of people, to then stop taking the pills. And so now they're medically, their brains have changed and they are addicted. And then trying to get off is very, very difficult. I had a very close friend who passed away. It was exactly as you said. Overdosed, got a Narcan shot, and then within a week was dead because it changed the ability of his body to deal with this stuff, and now he's gone. And I can't tell you how many people have had a similar experience. So what we have to be able to do is come together. This is not a Democrat issue, it's not a Republican issue. In fact, the Republicans, proud to say on your behalf, talked more during their primary about this very problem than the Democrats did. As you saw, the Republican primary rolled through parts of the country where this is a huge issue. So this is one of those rare common ground issues where if you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, if you are a human being, if you're a Smurf, if you're a remotely compassionate being, there's got to be a better way than having thousands of people do what the doctor said, take something the doctor prescribed to them, and then wind up in a literally a death spiral. And so there are good solutions from a medical point of view and from a legal point of view, political point of view, and we're working very hard together with Mr. Patrick Kennedy to try to get something done.
Let me mention, because you had pointed out that there's often a pain problem which leads to a legitimate prescription, which then leads to an addiction. So one of the people who has been watching and wrote in is Penny Barlow, and Penny said, after 2 back surgeries, my husband has finally been able to stop opioid use. Even though it was a necessary evil, the addiction was there with other non-addictive medication, and strong faith and family ties. He's doing great. I think one thing that would help is doctors who are more understanding of the long-run results. Know your patient, and not just medically, but personally. And I think this is one of the things in a book I've recommended highly, Dreamland, which I very, very real opportunity to deal with this. Is described, the most brilliant book I've read recently is a book called Dreamland, which Senator Portman suggests I read. And Dreamland, by a guy named Sam Quinones, Quinones, brings together the challenge of Mexican heroin, OxyContin is a legitimate prescription drug, but leading to addiction. A dramatic change in the 90s in how doctors thought about addiction and pain. And all of this weaves together into a story that's really, really sobering about where we are as a country today. And we're going to have to both confront how do we change in order to minimize future addictions, but also one of the things that Patrick Kennedy and Van and I are working on is what can we do now to enable people to have a very high likelihood of dealing with this kind of an issue. And what we've discovered, IMS just did a study, and they discovered that among the poorest people in America on Medicaid, there is an enormous difference in their ability to get help, running from a high of about 68% in Vermont to a low of 4% in Mississippi. And that one of the things we need to do is the governors and the state legislatures need to look at the degree to which the opioid recovery programs in their state are medically obsolete, don't deal with the new opportunities the buprenorphine and other kind of medical treatments help create, and really limit people's ability to get the kind of treatment they need.
Yeah. And part of why this is so relevant, why we want to talk about it tonight, is that there's actually a debate going on right now in Congress with the continuing resolution trying to figure out the funding that's necessary. And we're concerned and hopeful that the parties can come together. This is a life or death issue. There's about $37 million that some folks in Congress are trying to make available to begin to try to solve this problem. So you got a number of different problems. One is the government needs to come together on this and begin to make real progress. The other thing is that there is a stigma when it comes to addiction, and there should be, in terms of, nobody wants to have their life out of their own control. So you understand that. But different kinds of addictions work differently. You might be able to quit smoking just on pure willpower. Or maybe you can go through a 12-step program. For some people with alcohol, that makes a huge difference. But what we're finding with this particular set of problems with the opioid epidemic, that for an awful lot of people, some medical assistance is needed. Some kind of other pill that is not as damaging, is not as destructive, is not as likely to lead to death, to give people either a bridge away from it, or even if it winds up being a permanent prescription, at least you're not going to die from it. You can have a real life. It is very difficult. Listen, I'm somebody who I've never had a beer. I've never sipped champagne at a wedding. I am completely 100% in my own life scared of intoxicants. And so this is not special pleading. I'm saying, even as someone who's personally not had any experience with this, I know based on all of the data and all of the evidence that we are writing a death certificate for people when we tell them you have to go and figure this out on your own, get in a counseling program, and go through counseling and counseling and counseling, and then maybe if you don't die in the middle of the counseling program, then we'll let you have some medical support. I think we've got to have a different approach to this. I don't know all the different medications and the companies, all that sort of stuff, but I do know that there are better solutions than what we have going on. So I am hopeful that Congress will act. I'm hopeful that the continuing resolution will include this. Both parties have talked about it, but so far neither party has done enough about it.
Yeah, let me build on that for just a minute. The fact is that statistically we know that you can get a dramatically better long-term recovery if you have a medication support system, if you are in fact addicted to opioids. And we know that. There's plenty of evidence. We also know that in large part federal policy has been against this for a variety of reasons and has restricted access, has basically said, well, we're going to limit the number of doctors who can see people, we're going to limit the number of people they can see. And yet, here's the problem. If you had diabetes and you needed insulin, and we said, well, we think we ought to be able to talk you through this and counsel you through this, so you don't really need insulin. If you had a kidney problem and you need kidney dialysis, and we said, no, I think we change your diet for a while, get you to exercise a little more. We don't do that. There are places where we understand when it's your body, we have very clear medical conditions that have grown up over the last 100 years. Now, for the first time in the last 20 years, we've begun to have an ability to study living brains. Prior to that, for all practical purposes, except for very rare exception, the only brains we really studied were dead. And so we really didn't know much about how the brain worked. And we had a real tendency to isolate the brain from the rest of us. And that's why I've always been a strong advocate of mental health parity, because, look, the leading single health problem in America is depression. And depression leads to more secondary effects than any other health problem. Yet for years, we didn't even diagnose depression. And we'd wonder why people had all of these manifestations, all of which had grown out of their depression. Similarly, we're beginning to learn from basic research by being able to watch your brain as it responds, by literally using MRIs and other devices. Excuse me. So we now know what's happening to you, and we know the degree to which we can improve the chance of you surviving by having medication support. And our commitment, what we're working on, is to get the initial short-term funding as a bridge, but then to change the rules of the game so that whether you're a state or you're an insurance company, you deal with all the aspects of opioid recovery as a part of your health. Excuse me.
That's good. So there may be some other folks who've written in, there may not be. But
well, you mentioned one of the people who's one of my most faithful writers is Stephen Chrétien, and he asked a really interesting question. He said, should the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, introduce large cash prizes? My bias is yes. I think if we could get to an incentivized research package where people really focus on life-saving activities, I think we get much faster breakthroughs. And I think historically prizes work. They do focus and incentivize human beings, but we've never discussed it.
Look, I'm for it 100%. Like one of the things that it turns out a very high leverage and comparatively low cost way to get to a breakthrough is to say to the world, anybody that solves this problem is going to get $1 million, or frankly, sometimes it turns out the money is not even the most important incentive, though obviously big prizes maybe get more attention. It's just the idea that someone is going to recognize and reward you for figuring something out. And there's been this amazing pattern where the most unlikely people can solve these problems. Sometimes an astronomer can solve a problem for a biologist. They have a completely different paradigm. And they come in asking completely different questions, and they get to completely different outcomes. On these, so Stephen's right, on these life or death questions, where for whatever reason, the existing approach has run us into a cul-de-sac where the doctors want to do something about pain, but what they're doing is reckless, and then they can't do the responsible thing to get people backed out of the ditch. So you drive people into a ditch because you're so well-intentioned, you're concerned about the pain, but you can't back them out with good solutions because, well, geez, we don't want to be replacing one addiction with another. Well, you gave the addiction in the first place, so you got to do something. So when you have that level of dysfunction, saying, hey, listen, can anyone solve this? Does anyone have an idea? And if so, we will give you some recognition, some reward. I think that would be a very, very good addition to the mix of ideas here.
Yeah, let me say two things to Stephen. First of all, Senator Roger Wicker has introduced an initial prize bill for the National Institutes of Health, and it actually was included in a recent bill that passed the Senate. And Senator Wicker deserves a lot of credit for being innovative in approaching the whole question of how do we incentivize and create more interest in research in medical issues. Second, I just recently read a study that when Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic and became the first person to fly solo from New York to Paris, he did it for what was called the Ortiz Prize. The Ortiz Prize was created in 1919 by the Ortiz family, and it put up $25,000, which back then was a fair amount of money, and said whoever can fly from New York to Paris nonstop will win this prize. Well, it took 10 years, or I'm sorry, it took 8 years. But in 1927, when Lindbergh did it, they calculated that $400,000 had been spent by different people trying to develop an airplane and develop a system that would cross the Atlantic. So for a $25,000 prize, they were getting $400,000 worth of activity. And I think what it does is it lets a number of people who are particularly smart young researchers compete for the result when they'll never compete to get a grant inside a peer-reviewed system because they don't have the clout yet and they don't have the networking. So these are the kind of ideas. Thank you, Stephen. We're going to do more of these kind of Facebook Lives with my very good friend Van Jones, and I appreciate all of you this evening taking a few minutes off from Thursday Night Football to share with us. Thank you very, very much.